Good evening and a very warm welcome on a cold evening to the University of Glasgow. I'm Professor Andy Schofield. I'm the Principal and Vice-Chancellor of the University, and it really is an honour and a privilege to welcome you to our annual Holocaust Memorial Lecture. I also am welcoming our long-standing partners in this, the Association of Jewish Refugees, and we will hear something about them right at the end of the event. But their support has been invaluable throughout the history of this lecture series. And it is a lecture series that was founded here by one Professor Bernard Wasserstein, about whom we'll hear a little later and hear from a little later, but also founded by the late Professor Otto Hutter just after the turn of the millennium. And it was guided by a commitment to ensure that scholarship, testimony, and collective memory would endure across the generations. And this year's lecture is particularly meaningful. It is the 25 years since the first of the lectures, and it's also taking place in an anniversary year for the university itself. It's our 575th birthday, because this very month in 1451, the University of Glasgow was founded. And it's a milestone which prompts us to reflect on history and the responsibilities that come with it. Throughout our history as a university, we've been committed to ensuring that knowledge is used to transform society, that we pursue discovery and we challenge injustice, and we prepare generations of students to think critically, to act ethically, and also to engage thoughtfully with an ever-changing world. The Holocaust Memorial Lecture, therefore, sits very firmly within that tradition and is a key point in our annual calendar. And over the years, it has brought some of the most respected voices in Holocaust studies to this campus. And it's a reminder that our commitment to truth and understanding must never be diminished and must never be passive. Indeed, as we look in today's world, a world marked by rising division, ongoing conflict, and the experiences of communities facing discrimination and displacement, the need for spaces like this one becomes ever clearer. And the lessons of the Holocaust are urgent, they are present, and they are deeply relevant. So as we reflect on both the history of the university, its 575 years, and the 25 years of this lecture, we turn our attention to a conversation that invites us to engage with difficult and important questions that speak directly to the complexities of human choice in times of extreme peril. And the themes at the heart of this year's topic, such as resistance, collaboration, courage, and coercion, will challenge us to confront the realities of how people respond to oppression. And they remind us too of why universities must continue to create spaces for honest and critical inquiry and ensure that historic truth shapes how we understand the world today. So it is a particular honour and pleasure that Professor Wasserstein, Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Chicago, and indeed one of the original founders of this series, and also a great friend and colleague of the University of Glasgow, has returned to deliver tonight's lecture. Bernard Wasserstein is Emeritus Professor of History at the University of Chicago. Earlier in his career, he served as President of the Oxford Centre for Hebrew and Jewish Studies and as Professor of History at the University of Glasgow, as mentioned. His books include On the Eve, The Jews of Europe Before the Second World War, which was awarded the Yad Vashem International Book Prize. And most recently, he's written A Small Town in Ukraine, The Place We Came From, The Place We Went Back to. Tonight, Professor Wasserstein will explore the complexities of Jewish resistance and collaboration during the Second World War. And it feels especially fitting that one of the architects of this lecture series returns to examine these questions with us tonight, drawing on a lifetime of scholarship that has helped shape the very conversation we are continuing. So it is my great honour to introduce our speaker tonight. Without further ado, speaking on the subject of the Jewish resistance and collaboration in World War II, please join with me in welcoming Professor Bernard Wasserstein.
Principal, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'd like to invite you to turn your mind's eye back to a period when nearly all of us were not yet born, and in particular to December 1945, Warsaw, a dismal, battered, fearful place. Much of the city lay in ruins. Some of you who have been to Warsaw won't recognize this picture. A few of you might, because it is the old marketplace in Warsaw, which has been beautifully restored. But this is what it looked like, and indeed most of the city looked like, in December 1945. A vicious quasi-civil war had broken out between communists and nationalists. Out of the pre-war Jewish population of the city of about 350,000, only a pitiful remnant remained alive. And in a special court in Warsaw, on trial, in December 1945, was a 55-year-old Polish Jew accused of collaboration with the Nazis during the war. His name was Michał Weichert. A writer and a theatrical director, Weichert had trained under Max Reinhardt in Berlin, and worked for the Yiddish stage in Vilna and in Warsaw in the 1930s. During the early part of World War II, he had served as a local representative of the American Jewish charitable organization, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, which was a very large organization working overseas and which funneled money to relief efforts on behalf of Jews throughout the world. America's neutrality enabled the Joint, as it was called, to continue its activities in Poland with relative freedom even after the German occupation began in September 1939, and they were able to carry on with that until late 1941, until America entered the war. And even after that, the Allies allowed small quantities of relief supplies in the shape of food parcels and medical supplies to be sent to enemy territory, enemy-occupied territory, such as Poland. But they wouldn't permit such supplies to be sent direct to the occupation authorities, to the Germans, because they feared that if that happened, they would be expropriated by the Germans. And instead, they were dispatched mainly through the International Red Cross to Jewish bodies, even though those, of course, were under Nazi supervision. And the main such body in Poland was the so-called Jewish Self-Help Organization. It went through various names and forms, but that organization, it had its headquarters in Krakow, and that was the only Jewish organization permitted by the Nazis to function in occupied Poland. It established branches in ghettos and in hundreds of towns and villages throughout the country, and it carried on functioning even as, one by one, the Jewish inhabitants of those towns and ghettos were liquidated, murdered. Its head was Michał Weichert. At one level, Weichert's organization degenerated into something little more than a protection racket. A few years ago, I examined some miraculously surviving archival papers of this body. And I found that in each of the little Städtlach, the small towns of eastern Galicia, in what was then southern Poland, in those towns, Jews sought appointment as local representatives of this organization. For a small payment, this gave them the right to special documentation that they hoped might secure them favorable treatment by the Nazis, by the authorities. But the hope was short-lived. In most cases, this supposedly privileged status merely delayed rather than safeguarded them from sharing the fate of the rest of the Jewish populations. So on one hand, a kind of protection racket, but on the other hand, the organization perhaps did some good. One of its employees in one of those small towns, Migorod, later wrote, I quote, "We provided the social, nutritional, and sanitary needs of poor Jews in the town. We established a public kitchen that distributed each day 350 breakfasts and lunches. Money was obtained from various sources, including weekly contributions from well-established families in the town." Unquote. A less harmonious aspect of the operation is hinted at in an additional comment by the same man. Again, I quote, "Cases that refused to cooperate with us were referred to the office of the Judenrat, the Jewish Council, and they handled these situations." I'll come back to the councils in a moment. Now, Weichert survived the war, but he was subsequently accused of collaboration. Survivors alleged that he had diverted arriving supplies onto the black market. He defended himself by arguing that money earned by this means could be devoted more usefully to urgent needs, thus saving thousands of lives. Well, we will return to Weichert a little later, but let me first outline some of the issues raised by his trial and the larger historical context of resistance and collaboration during the war. Now, the historian Raoul Hilberg, in his monumental work, the first really serious work on the history of the Shoah, The Destruction of the European Jews, published in 1961, Hilberg discounted Jewish resistance as feeble. He asserted that Jews had held back from resisting the Nazis out of a deeply ingrained tradition of compliance with Gentile authority. But Hilberg's book relied primarily on captured German archives. And so inevitably, he tended to see things through German eyes. Later, confronted with abundant evidence of Jewish resistance, he qualified his earlier view. But meanwhile, another writer, Hannah Arendt, in her famous report on the Eichmann trial, published as a book in 1963, Arendt castigated Jewish elites, embodied in the Nazi-appointed Jewish councils. She called them accomplices in mass murder. Without their collaboration, she maintained, there would have, and I quote her now, there would have been plenty of chaos and plenty of misery, but the total number of victims would hardly have been between 4.5 and 6 million people, unquote. Well, Arendt's hypothesis was just that, a hypothesis for which she offered no evidence, nor reasoned argument. And absent those, we have no ground for accepting it, I would submit. Both Hilberg and Arendt were mistaken. In fact, whether as resistors or as collaborators, many Jews in occupied Europe manifested what historians like to call agency. That is to say, they made choices and acted on those choices, whether for better or for worse. Jewish resistance took many forms. There were the maquis in the French countryside, partisans in the forests of the Russo-Polish borderlands, rebel fighters in the ghettos, people smugglers across enemy lines, forgers of identity documents, fake ones, and undercover agents for the British and the Soviet secret services. There were also the Palestinian Jewish volunteers, people like Enzo Sereni from Italy and Hanna Senes, here she is, from Hungary, who were parachuted in by the British into their former homelands in the hope of helping to organize Jews to resist the Nazis. Most of those parachutists, there were a couple of dozen of them or so, most of them died in the effort. The 23-year-old Senes, it is said, was the only individual Jew specifically ordered by Adolf Hitler to be executed in person, I mean, as a person. And then, among resistors, there were those who took literally Churchill's injunction, you can always take one with you. The British historian M.R.D. Foote, tells the story of prisoners in the forced labor camp of Mauthausen, who were worked to death in a quarry. They were allowed an hour or so at midday to drink soup and listen to the camp orchestra. It was accepted practice that if they could stand the hell of life in Mauthausen no longer, they could jump over the edge into the pit of the quarry to their deaths. And two French Jewish prisoners, brothers, one day decided to jump. They spent their lunch interval shaking hands with their friends among the prisoners, and when the whistle blew, they walked up to the top of the quarry. Two of the usual jeering SS were there. They shook hands with them too, held on tight and jumped. Each, Foote reports, each took one with him, literally. Even while the war was going on, Jewish resistance became an inspiration and an instrument of war propaganda. For example, in June 1944, a little over a year after the rising in the Warsaw Ghetto, the Glasgow Jewish Institute players performed Ben Hecht's play, The Battle of the Warsaw Ghetto, at the Athenaeum Theatre in Buchanan Street. This image is from the archive of the Institute players, which is in Glasgow University Library. Now, understandably, whereas Jewish resistance was remembered with pride and admiration, Jewish collaboration, a much more troubling subject, left a much murkier imprint on the public memory. Yet there were ways in which collaboration and resistance often overlapped or were intertwined. At any rate, I would submit it's difficult to understand one without the other. Now, before my retirement, when I taught a course on the history of the Second World War at this university, amongst others, I used to propose to students that they consider several possible types of collaborators in general, not just Jews. The first, perhaps the most common type, was the drifter who slid into collaboration simply by carrying on with his or her job, pre-war job, under the occupation regime. For example, officials and policemen in the Channel Islands, occupied by the Germans during the war, who continued working under German occupation. Similarly, many civil servants and security personnel throughout occupied Europe did that. That might be called a form of collaboration. And the second type of collaborator consisted of those who were forced to collaborate. One thinks of the millions of laborers from all over Europe dragooned into working in German industry during the war. I think there were 13 million such foreign laborers in Germany by May 1945. And a third type consisted of what I call the mitigators. That's to say, those who hoped by collaborating to ameliorate the harshness of collaboration. These were people who decided to sup with the devil in order to try to preserve something of value amidst disaster. Yet they often found, as they got drawn deeper and deeper into the cauldron, that their spoons got shorter and shorter. A fourth type was the true believer in fascism or Nazism, who collaborated on ideological grounds. And examples of those included the American poet Ezra Pound, the French writer Louis-Ferdinand Céline, the Irish-American William Joyce, better known under his nickname Lord Haw-Haw, and the Norwegian puppet ruler, whose name became synonymous with this kind of traitor, Vidkun Quisling. That was the fourth type, the ideological believer. A fifth type was a special form of ideological collaborator who did not necessarily embrace fascism, but aligned with the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, or Japan, in the hope of advancing a different set of political beliefs, not necessarily fascistic, especially nationalistic, anti-colonial beliefs. And examples include the Indian Subhas Chandra Bose, the Palestinian Arab nationalist Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem, both of those broadcast for the Nazis from Berlin, and the Ukrainians Stepan Bandera and Roman Shukhevich, who led politico-military formations that fought for the Nazis and participated in roundups and massacres of Poles and Jews in the hope of securing German support for Ukrainian independence. And the sixth type, a final type, was the cynical opportunist, who, as the historian Richard Cobb later wrote, put public catastrophe to good private use. And examples include the so-called Smalchovniks, the Schmaltzovniks. These were people in Poland who blackmailed and betrayed Jews to the Nazis. Now one could no doubt point to other types, teachers who handed over their Jewish pupils to be deported to the death camps, or the pathetic so-called horizontal collaborators, women who, amid the joy of liberation, were humiliatingly paraded with shorn hair, spat on, or worse, by vengeful mobs. Now, the types I've mentioned, those 6 types, do not, of course, account for all collaborators, many of whom at the individual level might straddle more than one of those categories. Nevertheless, I would suggest that these are useful ways of analyzing the motives of most collaborators. Now, you may have noticed that all those I've mentioned by name so far were non-Jews. But what about the Jews? Can similar distinctions be drawn among Jewish collaborators? Well, let's take a look. First, then, those who just carried on. Now, in the Netherlands, where I live nowadays, we have the remarkable case of this man, Hans Max Hirschfeld, a senior civil servant who was Secretary General of the Netherlands Department of Trade, Industry and Shipping. Hirschfeld had a Jewish father and a Gentile mother. He was therefore not considered, a Jew according to Jewish religious law. Of course, that meant nothing to the Nazis. In the barbaric language of the Third Reich, he was categorized as a Mischling, a half-breed of the first degree, as they put it. Consequently, whereas his Jewish colleagues were expelled from the civil service, forced to wear yellow stars and ultimately deported to the death camps, Hirschfeld was allowed to remain at his post throughout the war. In fact, he became, in effect, the main architect and head of the Dutch economy during the war. He remained in post on instructions from the Dutch government in exile in London, who ordered him to do his utmost to safeguard the Dutch economy and society. He performed this task with conspicuous success, satisfying both his superiors in London and his more immediate masters, the German occupation authorities. Hirschfeld strongly opposed the resistance and made no recorded effort to save the lives of his Jewish countrymen. The leading Dutch historian of the occupation, Lou de Jong, a great historian, criticized him on that account. After the liberation, Hirschfeld was accused of collaboration. But after a lot of argy-bargy and trials, he was ultimately cleared and returned to work for the government. Now, was he a collaborator? Type 2, those forced to collaborate. The most extreme example were the so-called Sonderkommandos. Now, these were prisoners of war, sorry, not prisoners of war, they were prisoners at Auschwitz who were assigned to the most atrocious work in the camp, including removal of corpses from the gas chambers to the crematoria. The image I'm going to show now is horrifying, and you may wish to avert your eyes for a short period. This drawing by a former Sonderkommando prisoner, David Ollerer, is now in the Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum. In October 1944, by which time it was clear that the Sonderkommandos themselves would probably become the final victims of the killing process. You see, here's a Sonderkommando. Hauling the dead bodies. But once it was clear by October 1944 that they themselves would become the final victims of the killing process, the Sonderkommandos launched a revolt in the camp. Nearly all of them were killed. A handful survived. One of them, this man, Daniel ben Nahmias, a Jew from Thessaloniki, later published a quasi-memoir. It's available in English, and it's probably, I think it's impossible to read that book without a deep sense of revulsion. But it raises the awkward question, should such a man be considered as a collaborator or as a resistor? He did, after all, participate in that revolt, or both. I'll come back to that. Now, my third type, sometimes overlapping the previous group, consisted of those who collaborated with the occupying power, hoping or claiming at least to mitigate the extremities of persecution and murder. The most prominent examples were members of the so-called Judenräte, the Jewish councils, that in one form or another were established by the Nazis in much of occupied Europe to act as a vector for the transmission of German orders. In this picture, you see, for instance, the Jewish Council of Amsterdam. Notice all men, no women, all of a certain age. They were leading figures in the Jewish community. This man here was one of the, this man here, here he is. I don't know whether the laser pointer is working. Can you see it? Here his name was David Cohen. He was a professor of ancient history at the University of Amsterdam and the head of the Zionist organization in the Netherlands. And I think this is his co-chair here. His name was Abraham Asher. He was head of a big diamond factory in Amsterdam. And there were similar councils in many other parts of Europe. Hannah Arendt's merciless portrayal of the members of these bodies as opportunistic, self-seeking collaborators who participated, in effect, in the perpetration of mass murder, her picture provoked several rebuttals. The most persuasive, to my mind, I think to most minds, was the book by Isaiah Trunk, Judenrat, the Jewish Councils of Eastern Europe under Nazi occupation, which was published in 1972. And Trunk detailed the agonizing choices that confronted Jewish leaders ordered by the Nazis to serve on these bodies. They had no choice in the matter. They were ordered to do so. He analyzed their self-understanding and their rationalizations of their conduct. Trunk showed that, for the most part, the members of these Judenräte, at any rate in Poland, didn't volunteer. They were appointed and rarely had an opportunity to say yea or nay. He also noted that in some cases, Judenrat members covertly aided Jewish resistance. And he produced a statistical analysis of 720 members of Judenräte whom he identified in Poland during the war. And he showed that out of those 720, 182 were murdered before the deportations of Jews to the death camps. 383 were murdered during or after the deportations, and 9 committed suicide. Among those last ones, who committed suicide, was the leader of the Warsaw Judenrat, Adam Czerniaków. He killed himself in July 1942 when the mass deportations from Warsaw were at their height. Of the remainder, out of the 720, just 86 survived the war. Now, whatever else these numbers do not suggest that the Judenrat members were conspicuously successful in looking out for their own survival. Type 4, the ideological collaborator. Now, one might imagine that it would be impossible for Jews to conceive of any ideological affinity with the Axis. But that is not quite the case. In Italy, there were many Jewish supporters of fascism, at any rate until the dictator Mussolini decided in 1938 to ape Hitler by passing the first anti-Semitic laws in Italy. And among Jewish communities in the Far East, the right-wing Zionist Beitar youth movement in places like Harbin and Shanghai aligned itself with the Japanese invaders of China. Even in Nazi Germany, a handful of Jews who regarded themselves as staunch German patriots believed for a time that some form of modus vivendi with the Nazis was attainable. And one such was this man, a young religious philosopher and academic, Hans-Joachim Schoeps. Schoeps was a descendant of the great Jewish 18th century philosopher Moses Mendelssohn. He was intelligent, a gifted scholar, an effective speaker. He was a man of rigid political convictions. And from his early youth, he was anti-liberal, anti-Enlightenment. He was also anti-Zionist. He was hostile to the Weimar Republic, and he opposed the Jewish establishment in Germany. And when the Nazis came to power, he declared, and I quote, "Even if our fatherland repudiates us, the Jews, we will remain prepared for Germany," unquote. And in furtherance of that aim, he founded a movement, Der Deutsche Vortrupp, the German vanguard, a Jewish body, which secured 150 members. Small number, but still a number. Schoeps requested an audience with Hitler, not granted, and he wrote in Nazi publications that complaints about Nazi maltreatment of Jews were a libel spread by socialists and so-called Ostjuden, that's to say Jews from Eastern Europe, resident in Germany. Shortly after the Reichskristallnacht of November 1938, the mass pogrom in Germany, throughout Germany, Schoeps fled to Sweden with the help of a German diplomat, Werner Otto von Hentig. He spent the war years in Uppsala, in Sweden, while his parents were murdered by the Nazis. Schoeps was denounced by survivors after the war as a Heil Hitler Jew. Well, that's not quite correct. He's better described as an unreconstructed Prussian conservative. From exile, he actually denounced the Nazis as a band of criminals. Of course, Schoeps was an outlier in his attitudes, but he drew on a stream of super-patriotic thinking that many German Jews instinctively embraced. After the war, he returned to Germany, where he became a professor of religious philosophy at the University of Erlangen. Like many others, he believed there was no future for Jews in Germany, although he remained there. Yet his son, Julius Schoeps, is today as it happens, an Emeritus Professor of Jewish Studies at the University of Potsdam. Two other cases of what might more nearly qualify as intellectual collaboration involved Jewish women in France. The first was the American writer Gertrude Stein, here depicted by Picasso. She had been resident in France since 1903. During the Second World War, she lived there openly and unmolested. Offered an opportunity to leave in November 1940 and go back to America, she declined, explaining, I quote, "It would be awfully uncomfortable, and I am fussy about my food," unquote. She praised the Vichy head of state, Marshal Pétain, whose speeches she translated into English. A close friend of hers was the far-right Vichy-appointed, the Vichy state was the, in effect, puppet state established by the Germans after the fall of France. A close friend was the far-right Vichy-appointed head of the Bibliothèque Nationale, Bernard Wasserstein. He was later, after the war, sentenced to life imprisonment for giving aid to the enemy. Gertrude Stein contributed to publications close to Vichy, but she also contributed to others close to the resistance. In May 1943, however, she was placed on the Liste Otto of blacklisted Jewish authors, and from then on until the liberation, her pieces appeared only in Algiers. It remains unclear whether she and her partner, Alice B. Toklas, also Jewish, also American, whether they owed their survival to Gertrude's fascist connections, to her residence in the so-called free zone, exempt until November 1942 from direct German occupation, or whether they survived thanks to the protection of friends among local officials in the area in southeast France where they lived, or to her American passport. Vichy France, you see, maintained diplomatic relations with the United States until November 1942. After her death, Stein was denounced as, I quote, a major collaborator. Critics recalled a rash statement in which she had called for Hitler to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, though that was later explained away as ironical, and that may in fact be the case. The debate continues. Francesca Wade's recent biography of Gertrude Stein offers a measured, perhaps over-expiatory assessment of Stein's wartime conduct. Of course, friendship with French fascists does not in itself constitute collaboration with the Nazis. By that standard, Stein might be considered a crypto-communist on account of her close friendship with Pablo Picasso. As for her admiration for Pétain in the early part of the occupation, she shared that with, after all, much of the French population. Though in volunteering to translate his speeches into English for publication, she surely moved close to the edge of complicity. Now, another case of intellectual collaboration was that of the philosopher Simone Weil. No, there we are. Simone Weil, born in Paris to affluent Jewish parents, she beat Simone de Beauvoir into first place at the entrance exam for the École Normale Supérieure. She was one of the first women to be admitted to that elite institution. They sympathized with Marxism in the early 1930s and served briefly with the Republicans in the Spanish Civil War. Her attitude towards Judaism and Jews was troubled. The writer Thomas Nevin has written, I quote, "She did not consider herself a Jew, she did not want to be one, and placed herself with considerable advertisement in the Christian inspiration," unquote. And then he carries on, "Yet a Jew she was," unquote. In 1938, Weil wrote that she would prefer German hegemony over France to a war. And she wrote if the price of that German hegemony were what she called certain laws of exclusion against communists and Jews, she, in common, she thought, with the majority of the French nation, would have no objection. In the wake of the fall of France and the anti-Semitic Statut des Juifs, the anti-Semitic law passed by the Vichy government in October 1940, she wrote to the Vichy Minister of Education seeking a job and denying that she was Jewish. In 1941, when Vichy required all Jews to register as such, she refused, saying, "I would prefer to go to prison rather than to a ghetto." Like Stein, Weil wrote for both resistance publications and pro-Vichy ones. For a while, she was active in the resistance in Marseille. In 1942, she made her way to England, intending to volunteer to join de Gaulle's Free French movement. De Gaulle would have nothing to do with her. He said she was crazy. Her posthumously published writings of the war years express strong hostility to Judaism and to Jews. Professor Robert Zaretsky writes that by early 1943, Weil seems to have been willfully blind to the character and consequences of Nazi anti-Semitism. In August 1943, in a sanitarium in Kent, she starved herself to death. After the war, Weil's life and work were much celebrated, particularly by Catholic writers, no doubt because of her quasi-conversion during the war, although she was never baptized. For many readers, Zaretsky writes, Weil's life has all the trappings of secular sainthood. But her wartime record leaves a sour taste. Weil, the critic Susan Sontag concluded, I'm quoting her now, lived a life absurd in its exaggerations and degree of self-mutilation. Professor Benjamin Browder has perhaps come closest to the mark in defining Weil as a collabo-résistante, a label that might be applied with equal justice to Gertrude Stein. Well, let me move on to my fifth type, the nationalist collaborator. Unlike Ukrainians or Indian nationalists or Palestinian Arab ones who looked to the Nazis for support, no Jew in his right mind surely could imagine that Hitler would endorse Jewish nationalism. Yet a few fanatics in British-ruled, as it then was, British-ruled Palestine came to believe just that. They were the members of the Fighters for the Freedom of Israel, known by the acronym of their Hebrew name as Lehi, and to the British after the founder of that movement, this man, Abraham Stern. He was a young poet. According to Stern, whereas the Palestinian Arabs were merely rivals of the Jews for control of Palestine, the British were what he called enemies. And pursuing that logic to its absurd terminus, Stern concluded that the enemy's enemies must become his friends. First, he courted Mussolini. He had spent some time in Italy studying. Mussolini's army was advancing against the British in North Africa, but when that effort failed, Stern conceived the fantastic notion of an alliance with Nazi Germany. In late 1941, he sent an emissary, a man called Naftali Lubenczyk, to Beirut to meet a man we've already met this evening, Werner Otto von Hentig, the man who had facilitated the passage of Hans-Joachim Schoeps to Sweden from Germany in 1938. Lubenczyk went to meet Hentig and he offered him the active participation of the Sternists in the war on the German side. On setting one condition, and that was that the aspirations, as he put it, of the Israelite freedom movement are recognized. But Berlin took no more interest than Rome. When no reply was received to this overture, Stern tried again, and in 1941 he dispatched a second emissary, Nathan Friedman Yellin, later known as Yellin Moore, Hebraized his name. But he was arrested in Syria en route before he could make contact with the Germans in neutral Turkey. Well, Stern was killed by British police in Palestine in February 1942, but his followers carried on. In 1944, Sternists assassinated the British minister in the Middle East, Lord Moyne, in Cairo. Yellin Moore, who was one of the three triumvirate who headed the movement after Stern's death, Yellin Moore was elected to the first Knesset, Israeli parliament, in 1949, and he later became a far-left activist. Another member of that triumvirate, Isaac Izernitsky, later served as foreign minister and then prime minister of Israel under his Hebraized name, Yitzhak Shamir. My sixth type, the cynical opportunist. Now, many Jewish policemen in the ghettos fell into this category. In general, they were not forced to serve. In the Warsaw Ghetto, for example, members of the so-called Jewish Order Service, in effect Jewish police, between 1940 and 1943, were offered various privileges and inducements to serve, such as exemption from forced labor, or extra rations, or an apartment, or provision of health care, and so on. And at the outset, thousands volunteered, and some paid large sums to secure admission to the force. The chronicler of the Warsaw Ghetto, the historian who died during the war, Emanuel Ringelblum, wrote, I quote, "Everyone is pulling strings to get these sought-after positions," unquote. 2,000 men were admitted to the force by January 1941. their jobs, rather these men included lawyers, engineers, young yeshiva graduates, and sons of businessmen with connections. A few were converts to Christianity. Some were assimilated Polish-speaking Jews, but the majority were ordinary Yiddish-speaking ones. Their duties ranged, particularly at the beginning, from such inoffensive tasks as traffic regulation, sanitation, and price controls, to later on guarding the entrances and exits to the ghetto at its perimeter, and participating in roundups, often using brutal violence. Many were corrupt, and eventually bribes became their main source of income. They weren't actually paid. They were greatly hated by denizens of the ghetto. Some were shot by Jewish resistors, but a few joined the resistance. When the end of the ghetto came in April 1943, the horrific ultimate logic of their position became manifest. The remaining members of the force guarded their own deportation from the Umschlagplatz, the collection point for transportation from Warsaw to the Treblinka death camp. Now, also among this sixth type of collaborator, the opportunists, were informers who betrayed their fellow Jews to the Nazis, particularly Jews in hiding. One such was Friedrich Weinreb, a Polish-born economist who lived in the Netherlands. During the war, Weinreb developed a lucrative racket. Claiming to have the ear of German senior officials, he offered for sale places on lists that supposedly guaranteed Jews security from deportation. There was a grain of truth in his claim, since he did indeed coordinate his activities with the Germans. But far from saving his Jewish customers, Weinreb betrayed them to the Nazis, and most were deported to their deaths. After the war, Weinreb was arrested, and he was sentenced to 3.5 years imprisonment, later on appeal increased to 6. But in 1948, he was among those, including several senior Nazi war criminals in Holland, who were granted an amnesty by Queen Wilhelmina. Later, he moved to Switzerland, where he embarked on a new career as a kind of Orthodox Jewish guru. His apologia for his wartime conduct, published in 3 volumes in Dutch, came to a total of 1,926 pages. Some credulous folk came to his defense, maintaining that far from being a collaborator, he was a resistor who had saved many lives. And he became a particular hero of countercultural far leftists in Amsterdam in 1968. Fierce controversy over his wartime record led in 1970 to the appointment of an inquiry committee by the Royal Institute of War Documentation, headed by the historian Lou de Jong. The institute was headed by him. This committee found against Weinreb, but he continued to maintain his innocence. And as the Anglo-Dutch writer Ian Buruma has written in his recent book, The Collaborators, when Weinreb died in Switzerland in 1988, Buruma writes, he was still revered by a loyal group of disciples who believed that his wisdom contained the keys to unlocking the mysteries of life. Well, so much for my 6 types of collaborator. In the case of Jews, as of others, the characteristic response in the immediate post-war period tended to be to view all forms of collaboration as criminal and to pursue collaborators through the courts, both the ordinary criminal courts and so-called courts of honor established by Jewish communities in several countries. In Poland, about 150 alleged collaborators were tried before such courts of honor between 1946 and 1949, although no more than a quarter of those accused were found guilty. And elsewhere too, such trials had mixed and sometimes ambiguous results. So now, let us return to the trial of Michał Weichert in Warsaw, with which I began, in December 45, January 46. This picture of a trial is not actually of his own trial, but rather of a scene in a play that he had directed in Warsaw in 1933, depicting the infamous Sacco and Vanzetti trial in Boston a few years before that. Now, Weichert might be assigned to more than one of my 6 categories. The state court, where he was tried at first, found him not guilty of collaboration. But his case was later considered by a Jewish court of honor, which declined to exonerate him. His name, as a result, remained tarnished. In 1957, he moved to Israel, and he spent the rest of his life there. And like Weinreb, he spent most of the rest of his life writing several volumes of apologetic memoirs published in Yiddish. His argument was, in essence, that a certain level of collaboration was, of coordination, let's say, with the authorities, had been the only means through which the horrors of Nazi genocide might be mitigated. Some of his readers were persuaded. The famous, in that period, Yiddish actor and writer Jonas Turkov went so far as to declare that, and I quote, Weichert's organization had represented all that was best and noblest in Jewish Warsaw, unquote. So should Weichert be seen as a collaborator, or as a resistor, or as a helpless pawn? Or was he perhaps a bit of all 3 at the same time? Historians' attitudes towards collaboration in general during World War II have evolved considerably since the immediate post-war period, when the phenomenon was generally viewed straightforwardly in black and white terms. In some quarters, though, the pendulum has swung to the opposite extreme. In his History of Europe, published in 1946, the British historian Norman Davies criticized what he termed the Allied scheme of history, which he maintained had for too long dominated writing about the Second World War, and which, in particular, he objected to what he called the ideology of anti-fascism. In particular, he complained that individuals and nations who fought on the German side, such as the Ukrainian nationalists, for instance, bear the stigma, as he called it, of collaboration. And the ne plus ultra of such revisionist writing is a book published in 1999 by another British historian, Rab Bennett. It's called Under the Shadow of the Swastika. And he explores the moral issues involved in resistance and collaboration. And his overall conclusion is that insofar as the resistance to a ruthless oppressor might have and did endanger large numbers of innocent people, threatened with reprisals. One thinks of the cases of Oradour and Lidice, which many of you will be familiar with. Insofar as in resistance could lead to those sorts of ruthless reprisals, resistance should be seen, Bennett argues, as a morally questionable act. So should we retain the black-white dichotomy of the early post-war period, or should we embrace the topsy-turvy view of Davies and Bennett that seems to censure the resistance and excuse those once denounced as collaborators? Or is there another way? Well, what I've tried to show is that both resistance and collaboration were protean phenomena. Protean phenomena. There were many varieties of resistor and collaborator, each with different motives and codes of conduct. Resistance and collaboration were often not as distinct as one might imagine. They sometimes overlapped or crisscrossed. Well, the resistors and collaborators are all, or nearly all, dead now. That might enable us to look at them with a degree of historical objectivity. But as one reviewer of Trunk's book put it, I quote, "Objectivity would be indecent here. We're not judges, but we're also not neutral chroniclers. Some moral accounting surely is inevitable and necessary. None of us can know for certain how we would have responded to the almost unimaginable pressures and the anguishing dilemmas that faced Jews in occupied Europe between 1939 and 1945. But contemplating the choices that they made may help us to clarify our own value systems and fortify us to confront, as the principle suggested at the beginning, to confront the different, but in some respects, no less threatening challenges that we confront, that we face in our own time.
Professor Wasserstein, you've kept us enthralled and thoroughly enjoyed your lecture. We're almost out of time, but I do want the audience to have some interaction with you. And so maybe we'll just take one or two questions just as we conclude. There is a microphone. If anybody has got a question, could you indicate in the usual way, namely raising a hand? Or say goodbye. I think you've held us so gripped, but perhaps I will ask a question. Obviously, the nuance and complexity of the individuals whose stories that we've heard illustrates the difficulty and the uncertainty of how one would choose to respond. For obvious reasons, I suppose the stories of those who resisted are fewer in number, given the outcome, just simply because they presumably did not always survive in the same way. But I imagine you could tell the same story of nuance of resistors whose motivations might have been varied. Are there any that you're particularly struck by? I mean, I myself by the two brothers you talked about. Are there others that have particularly resonated with you?
Well, of course, the prime example of resistance was the rebellion in the Warsaw Ghetto in April and May 1943 that I mentioned in passing. It was a tragic and remarkable episode because there was no hope. It was a purely demonstrative act at the very end of the mass deportations from Warsaw that the leaders, generally young men and women, of the revolt, embarked on in order to show that they had not gone like sheep to the slaughter. But one of the tragic things about the Warsaw Ghetto Rising, both while it happened and indeed since then, was the fierce divisions within it based on political allegiance. Between, on the one hand, the right-wing nationalist Betar movement, and on the other hand, more left-wing elements, such as the Labour Zionists and the non-Zionist Bund socialist movement. They argued bitterly, and one of the tragic aspects of the historiography of it is that since the war, the adherents of these movements have continued to argue, trying to claim primacy of recognition for their particular movement within this rebellion.
That's fascinating. Thank you. Now, before closing the event, I wanted to invite Alex Moores from the Association of Jewish Refugees just to say a few words, and then I will draw the evening to a conclusion.
Thank you very much. Is that on? Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for tonight's event. Just to say, my name is Alex Moores. I'm head of education and heritage at the Association of Jewish Refugees, whose logo you've seen here. And I wanted to just say how proud we are to be sponsoring this event. For those who aren't familiar with the Association of Jewish Refugees, we are the nation's charity that supports Britain's Holocaust refugees and survivors, and I'm never allowed in front of a microphone without saying, if you know anyone in your life who could still benefit from our social welfare services, from our support, please do get in touch with us. It's also important to say that the theme of this year's Holocaust Memorial Day is bridging generations, and that's very apt in the world of the Association of Jewish Refugees as well. As you can imagine, an organization whose primary members for the past 85 years have been survivors and refugees from Nazism, we too are looking to bridge generations and increasingly looking to the next generation of AJR members. If your family has a particular connection to the Holocaust, please do learn more about the AJR. We are very much taking on members from the second, third generations and those who just have some other sort of personal connection to it. So one of the ways we are looking to bridge generations is through our support of educational initiatives, and that's what brings us here tonight. And I'm so pleased to finally have had a chance, after many years of supporting this event from afar, to join my local colleagues and AJR members in attending it in person. It seems incredibly appropriate to be standing under the motto of University of Glasgow, Via Veritas Vita, in an era where the history of the Holocaust is very much under attack, that on Holocaust Memorial Day we should be reminded that it is up to all of us to protect the truth of it. But as we have heard in tonight's lecture brilliantly from Professor Wasserstein, the truth is often a matter of, as you've said, nuance and complexity. And so it's so inspirational to come to an event like this, where so many people are willing to spend this day not just sort of engaging in the sort of normal traditional acts of remembrance, but really getting stuck in with the sticky details of history and learning about it. So first, I would like to thank Professor Wasserstein for that amazing lecture on behalf of the Association of Jewish Refugees. It's an honor to have you here tonight. And special thanks go out to the organizers of this event from the University of Glasgow, to Professor Andy Schofield. Thank you very much to Henry Lovett and Mia Spiro for organizing this year after year. Thank you for that. And to Laura Wishart from the events team. Just a round of applause to everyone who's been involved in this. And then And finally, because I don't want to keep you from your dinner for any longer, just to say, it is not many people's idea of a good time to spend a very cold and rainy Tuesday evening in January listening to, as I said, a very nuanced and complex lecture about Holocaust history. But you all have chosen to do that, and that says something tremendous about this community here in Glasgow. And I want to thank all of you for coming out tonight to this event, and I very much hope I will be able to join you here at many of these in the future. So the final round of applause, please give one to yourselves.
Thank you again. Thank you, Professor Wasserstein, and I wish you a good evening and safe journey home. Thank you all.